Okay, now let's finish up plant diversity. So here we have the angiosperms, whose innovation is the production of the flower and the fruit. We'll talk much more about angiosperms under when we talk about plant form and function. But the basic parts here, the flower, of course, you have the petals, then you have the stamens, which are the male parts, the pistil, which is the female part, and each of these little things in here is one of those ovules, which will develop into seeds after fertilization. The sepals, which are leaf-like structures that cover the flower when it's in bud. And in addition to the flower, also the fruit. And a fruit is basically a structure on a plant that contains is an enclosed structure that contains the seeds. So cones officially are not fruits. But a tomato officially is a fruit, as well as, of course, an orange or a peach. Some fruits are fleshier and have lots of seeds. Some just have a single seed. Some are dry. Some sort of crack open and disperse their seeds. How are fruits useful for plants? Well, the main goal is to get that seed or the seeds inside them dispersed, whether it's through getting caught on an animal's fur, blowing on the wind, or in this case, these fleshy kind of fruits are often brightly colored, and the goal is to be eaten so that then the animal will disperse the seeds out the other end later on. Alright, so the angiosperm's life cycle, again, we have alternation of generations, a multicellular diploid and haploid stage. So here we have the main part of the plant, the sporophyte generation, and it will develop the flowers, whose job is to produce microspores in the case of the stamens and megaspores in the case of the ovules, the female part, producing those spores, which will develop into the pollen grain and then into the egg, and you'll get dispersal of the pollen, again usually sometimes by wind or usually by animals, from the male to the female part, fertilization inside the ovule where the embryo will develop and the protective coverings of the ovule become the seed coat, and the seed is dispersed and begins the next generation. Now, most flowering plants can be divided into two main groups. There are some really primitive types of flowering plants that don't fit into these two groups, but the vast majority of them do. You have the monocots and the dicots, sometimes known as the eudicots. Characteristics. Monocots, the term cotyledon basically refers to a seed leaf, and monocots have one and dicots have two. Monocots usually have parallel veins on their leaves, where dicots have a net-like leaf or vein arrangement on their leaves. Vascular bundles in monocot stems are sort of arranged throughout the stem, where on dicots they're arranged in a ring towards the outside of the stem. The roots of monocots are described as fibrous. There's no single main root, whereas on dicots, they typically have a taproot, which has roots coming off of it. Little difference in pollen structure, but what we want to see here is the floral structures. And monocots typically come in groups of 3. They'll have 3, 6, 9, etc. And in dicots, they come in 4s or 5s. So if you see a flower which has petals in units of 3, you can be pretty sure it's a monocot, and if they're in 4 or 5s, you can be sure they're a dicot. Animals and flowering plants have co-evolved quite a bit. We already talked about pollination, again a very significant co-evolutionary relationship between many animals and many types of plants. Some of these relationships are quite specific, and plants have evolved in particular ways to focus on their pollinators. For example, with hummingbirds, those flowers tend to dangle down because the hummingbird hovers. They tend to be relatively large, showy red flowers because hummingbirds search by sight for those flowers. Bees, those flowers come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. They tend to be yellows and blues. they're going for both pollen and nectar, whereas hummingbirds are just going for the nectar. Bats, you have some bats that pollinate flowers when a bat's out at night, so they'll tend to be white flowers because they're easiest to see at night. And our welfare depends a lot on plants. Of course, most of our food comes from flowering plants. We also use them for other things, obviously wood from trees. Also, a lot of medicines have been derived from plant compounds. And so yeah, most of the calories we consume come from plants, and just a relatively few plants, these here: wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, and in tropical areas, cassava is a type of starchy plant, and sweet potatoes as well. Again, vast majority of calories. And since the advent of the agricultural revolution, people have been modifying these plants through selective breeding, and more recently through genetic engineering to have particular traits in these plants, producing lots of seeds and large seeds and seeds that have particular flavors and fruits that have particular flavors, etc. Again, those secondary compounds, by secondary compound, we mean it's a compound that's typically not of vital importance for the survival of the plant, but they're compounds that are produced sometimes as natural insecticides for the plant. And some of these compounds we have figured out have medicinal purposes for us. And of course, people have known about this for thousands of years in ancient societies, but we're now relearning some of this information. There are many pharmaceutical companies that go down to the tropics to test plants for particular compounds, and here's some, of course, morphine from the poppy plant, digitalis from the foxglove, also aspirin, which comes from the bark of willow trees, is another good example. So there you go, that's plants.